Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to iNACOL's September Leadership Webinar. My clock here says 2 p.m. Eastern, so we will go ahead and get started as some folks continue to trickle in today. Thank you all so very much for joining us. We are thrilled to learn from you all today and thrilled to learn from our presenters, too. My name is Natalie Abel. I'm a program manager here at iNACOL, and I will be helping to facilitate today's webinar. So before I turn it over to our presenters, I have just a couple housekeeping items to go through with you. In the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you should see a chat box, and if you haven't done so already, please introduce yourself. We'd love to know who you are, where you're tuning in from, what organization you're with, any insights and experiences you have in this work, and any questions you brought with you today. We really want this to be a lively, engaging discussion, so please share your own experiences and insights as we go. We're going to pause at times throughout the webinar to pose questions to you all, asking for your feedback on this important work. But we will also save time at the end for Q&A. So please be sure to ask your questions to the presenters, and we'll make sure those get answered for you. We encourage a really rich dialogue, and we look forward to learning from you today. We also encourage you to share what you're learning on Twitter using hashtag #EdLeaders, and be sure to connect with us. We'll share our, thank you, Ashley, for sharing the social media information in the chat box. So be sure to extend your learning beyond this webinar to your networks, peers, and professional learning communities on social media as well. And today's webinar will be recorded and archived on inacol.org. So we'll send you a follow-up email within the next couple days that'll have a link where you'll be able to download the slides from today's webinar and review the entire webinar recording as well. So you'll be able to revisit these discussions, refer back to something you may have missed, or share the webinar with your colleagues and peers if you choose. Also, if you have any audio issues during the webinar, please let me know through the chat box. I can share instructions with you on how to run the audio setup wizard if you haven't already done that, which should level set your speaker volume and optimize your listening experience here with us today. So with that, we are grateful to have Liz Gloa and Barbara Tracy here with us today to explore what leadership looks like in student-centered learning environments. I'll let them go into more detail, but as part of a discovery process, Liz and Barbara conducted some early research to examine what's different or essential about leadership in student-centered learning environments, and what leadership is necessary to support and sustain this shift in district schools and programs. So with that, Barbara, I will now turn it over to you, and you can take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Liz and I are so happy to be here with all of you. Thank you all for coming. And I'm glad to see all of the introductions in the chat box. I know some of you are here in groups, and we have several poll questions just to elaborate a little bit more on who's here. So for those of you who are listening, participating as a group, I guess you'll have to take the average of the people in your group as you respond to the poll question. The first question is, and we'll share right out with you the responses we want to know, but I know you want to know too. So the first question is, what is your role? There's a little icon for those of you who haven't participated in a Collaborate poll before. The most right icon underneath your name is how you participate in the poll. So choose the response in your poll question. Okay, so I can see if everybody can select just what is your leadership role. We've provided 4 choices: school-based leadership, district leadership, state leadership, or another role which may not be a leadership role. But if you can go ahead and click the appropriate response, choosing the icon right under your name It's the icon most to the right. Okay. So you see we have some school and some school-based leadership. It looks like most of the people here are not in a particular leadership role, and I know some of you can't access the poll because you're participating either by phone or and not on the web. Okay, if everybody can continue to respond. And Natalie, maybe refresh the poll results. Okay, great. So we're seeing it. We have a range of leadership roles from a lot of school-based leadership. That's the majority of the leadership roles, and many of you are in another role. Okay, so thank you for sharing that. We'll know a little bit more as we move on to the next question. And Natalie, maybe you can clear that out. For those of you who are in whatever role you're in, especially the leadership role, how many years have you been in this position? We know people are changing roles over time. And so for those of you, particularly if you're in a leadership role, how long have you been in that role? So again, there are 4 choices: 1 year, 2 to 3 years, 4 to 6 years, or 7 or more years. It seems pretty even responses between all of the different choices. So some are pretty new to their roles, spread out all the way up to a number of you are 7 or more years. Okay, I don't know if you want to refresh it one more time to see if there have been any more responses. And it's about the same, although the 2 or 3 years seems to have increased. Most of you are either 1 year or 2 to 3 years. Good to know. Okay, so we have one more question for you, which is how many years have you been implementing student-centered learning in your school district or other organization? And we provided 4 choices again: not implementing at this time, just getting started, mid-range, 3 or 4 years, or been at it for a while, 5 or more years. So go ahead and select the most appropriate choice that applies to how long you have been implementing student-centered learning. And just as a quick reminder, one reference point that we use is the student-centered, Students at the Center framework, which talks about 4 components of student-centered learning. Learning is personalized, learning is competency-based, learning happens anytime, and the 4th, students take ownership of their own learning. So just curious how long, those of you, if you've been implementing student-centered learning and for about how long. And maybe we can refresh it one more time. Okay, so the biggest group, as you can see, are those who are getting started and in your 1st or 2nd year. But we've got some pretty experienced people here as well as some who have not gotten started. So good to know who we have among us, and you can also continue sharing who you are, introducing yourself, so we'll know not just the in general, but also individually who's here and what organizations you represent. Okay, a little bit of background on where this webinar came from and the work that Liz and I have been doing for 1 to 2 years on leadership in partnership with iNACOL, working with iNACOL. As you know, and especially looking at the responses, there is a lot of excitement for educators across the United States and actually around the world that people are beginning to transform their schools and learning organizations into more student-centered, more personalized, more equitable learning environments. This is exciting work, and research tells us that effective leadership is pretty critical to the success and sustainability of of this transformation. And so we embarked on a process to learn more about the leadership role and how school leadership is changing in these environments. What does it take for leadership to enable, to support, and what does it take to really sustain the changes that learning organizations are making to student-centered environments? So we worked on an initial discovery process just to find out what the field knows and what's going on so that we could prepare to dig deeper over time. So 3 core activities guided our work. At the iNACOL symposium last year, we did an initial convening of leaders from across the country representing different organizations to give us some input about this question. How is leadership changing? What does it take to sustain student-centered learning? And what are the key questions that are being addressed in the field as learning organizations transition? And in particular, what are the key questions for leadership as they lead this transition? Second, we conducted an extensive literature review. The literature looked at both existing education leadership literature, which there is a wide range and deep field of education leadership that touched on transformational leadership. We looked at that rich history of education literature, as well as many of the new and emerging leadership literature that is coming out from organizations that have emerged directly involved in transformation to student-centered learning. So we both looked at the historical education literature as well as a lot of new literature, also recommendations that people made to us along the way. So our literature review kept growing. And we've collected a lot of that, and it's connected to the blog that we published a couple of weeks ago, which Liz will tell you more about and how to find it. We also conducted a series of interviews. As we did the literature review, we identified a wide range of leaders to speak with, that we could delve into the questions that were emerging from the literature review. The leaders represented a wide range of roles, a wide range of education settings, from schools, districts, state level, and leadership programs, and leaders of nonprofit as well as for-profit organizations that are working with schools and other learning organizations that are making the transition to student-centered learning. As we conducted these interviews and our literature review, 5 core questions guided our work, and we're going to tell you about these 5 questions and delve in particular into the second question that I'm going to talk about on this slide. And these were the questions that we posed to the people that we interviewed. The first question is which we kept coming back to, how is the question of leadership in student-centered, personalized, transforming environments, how is the definition changing and how is it expanding? We had a lot of conversations, including back at the iNACOL symposium last year. For example, what is leadership? Is leadership something that's embodied in a person or in a group of people? Or should we understand leadership particularly as it's changing more as a function, for example, or is it a little bit of both? So delving into those kinds of questions were the first thing that we talked about in our interviews and that guided what we were looking for in the literature. The second question, which is featured in this webinar as well as in our blog post, is to really dig into what we wanted to know is what is essential and what is different about leadership in these environments. So not only what did the traditional ed leadership tell us about leadership for transformation, but glean from that what is really different for leaders that are trying to lead their organizations to this transition as well as sustain it. So that you are going to learn a lot more about. We have a bunch of key highlights from that question in particular that we're going to share with you. The third question, which is, in part related to the traditional language of standards, we asked and searched for what we could learn about what are the key dispositions, the skills, and the knowledge that leaders in these transforming, in these student-centered environments need to have. And this question related to the first two questions as well, but we also teased out this question in particular. The fourth question that we investigated is what contributed to the success or lack of success in moving schools to student-centered learning environments. So the second question focused in particular on the leadership role, and the fourth question was kind of what are the other factors that contributed to being able to lead organizations to student-centered learning. The fifth question, little bit different type of question. We both were trying to gather information about the range of where leaders were getting their inspiration and getting their guidance. And it was a very interesting discussion that we had with the people that we interviewed. We also wanted to know, we recognize the importance of the new PSEL standards, the professional standards for education leaders that was published in 2015. It was it's the updated version of the ISLIC standards that was put together published by the National Policy Board for Educational Administration, which includes an important group of national education and leadership organizations, CCSSO being a primary member of this group, as well as other education leadership organizations. And we wanted to talk with people about how these standards are guiding the work that they do, and so that was another core question that we investigated. So I'm going to turn it over to Liz to tell you more about what we're going to focus on. That was the background to the work that we did, and Liz is going to highlight some of our findings.
Sorry, good afternoon. A little bit of a cold, so I'm a little raspy, sorry. Today what we really want to be able to do is share what we've learned, also to be able to learn from you in reaction to some of the things that we've learned. After we had gone through this process of gathering information, I can't tell you how in-depth and long the conversations Barbara and I had as we tried to really be able to categorize these. So what you're going to see is our attempt at some categorization. We also walked away with, now here's some areas that might warrant some further investigation or research, and are hoping that people will continue to look at this in terms of the process. We would like to have your input on what you think needs to be investigated or researched, so that as iNACOL provides feedback back to those in the research field, we can say that we were also able to gather additional input from people participating in this webinar, and also through some of the Twitter feeds we hope we get. So as Barbara said, the question that this particular webinar is going to focus on is what's essential or different about leadership in schools and learning communities that have been successful in moving forward to student-centered learning environments and in sustaining that forward movement. Part of what we found as we were going through this is some people have been successful in moving forward, but not in sustaining. So we were equally interested in what does it take to sustain something that is as big a transformation as what we're talking about here. There are numerous areas of leadership that were emphasized by the interviewees and identified in the literature. Of them, we're going to only highlight 8, and we'll describe each briefly. In the last slide, there is a link to the blog, and in the blog, what we have are links that go back actually to our source documents and organizations. So if you're interested in this and you want to get in more depth, you can go to that blog and just go back to what we gleaned from the interviews and the literature review. These are not presented in any kind of priority order, so I'm just going to start rolling through them. The first key area that we're talking about here is that leadership engages in courageous conversations and actions. Leaders in these environments challenge current practices, and they foster innovations through conversations and actions aligned to a compelling vision. They act and listen to feedback while being able to withstand politics while people resist this vision. And this is one of the things that came out pretty clearly was when you are going through this depth of transformation, there can be a great deal of resistance, and these leaders are the ones that don't hold back when it starts getting messy. They believe in the destination that they're going to. They keep working towards it so that they persist through the messiness and the challenge. Their persistence, their beliefs, and their facilitative approaches help move others on. The second area, there's a shift in the leadership power dynamics and in the importance of context. Leadership is more inclusive, distributive, and collaborative in these settings rather than being delegated and top-down. It is shared very purposefully and in a coordinated way based upon the context within which the leaders are operating. Some of what we heard was people who are in the first and second year are able to share the leadership in a different kind of way than people who are in the fourth or fifth year, where it's become more of the fabric of the school and the leadership can be shared in even a greater distributed kind of manner. Students are increasingly taking on meaningful leadership roles in their learning institutions and also in their communities. All of the research that we read and the school leaders that we talked to agreed that a shift from a teacher-centered to a student-centered learning environment is not going to be successful if it's championed only by one school leader, that any major shift in the culture requires collaborative support and leadership at all levels, that all members of the school community have to believe in the need for change and collaboratively set goals and expectations. They also agreed that this is, for some leaders, very challenging because it requires them learning how to let go. They have to trust and have faith in the system that their school community is building or has built, and that the system is strong enough and the guardrails are strong enough that the school can move forward without top-down leadership. We heard some great examples of where they've been able to move from this top-down leadership to the inclusive, distributive, and collaborative leadership. The third key area was that leadership has an intensified focus on learners and the school as a learning community. There's a culture of we're all learners. And when they think of all, they're thinking of it's not only students and staff, it's also parents and others involved in the community. All of these learners have roles, voice, and agency, and leadership creates the conditions that encourage the active learning, not only amongst the students, but amongst teachers and the wider community. The leadership pays attention, the attention that leadership pays to adult learning mirrors the leadership that they pay to students' personalized learning. There is a huge professional development effort that goes on in these schools that the leadership is involved in as a participant and as a leader. Student-centered leaders are actively involved in developing leadership capacity and sustainability throughout their community and also in promoting equity and diversity. The fourth key area that emerged is that there's meaningful and substantial student and community involvement in the leadership of learning and of the organization. Leadership is very intentional and deliberate in involving the whole community, which, as we heard in the previous key area, includes students, staff, parents, and community partners. It's also very intentional and deliberate in developing the leadership capacity across this whole school community. Because leadership is widely distributed across the whole school organization, there's a broad community of parents and agencies to support learning and to support and sustain the transformation of the school. This particular one became incredibly important when we started looking at sustainability in terms of being able to build that kind of leadership capability and that level of involvement across the whole community. Students are included in leadership, and they see their families acting as leaders and contributing to the school community, so they feel empowered. And leadership demonstrates a keen understanding of the community and the current and historical context of the community members and their impact on the community's families and students. Researchers, in the research that they've done on the effect of student-centered learning schools and whether or not they do have an impact on achievement, said that while student-centered schools can make some difference, in order to make a substantial difference in the lives of all students, education leaders have to be focused on activities within their institution and bring the community in as a giving and receiving partner in an equitable manner. And so there's this huge emphasis now, even more than when I was a principal, on community involvement, community support, both as the community giving and also as the community receiving. The fifth area really was looking at, there's an increased use of quality improvement approaches in designing and implementing change and innovation, with an understanding that continuous improvement is foundational in creating and sustaining the learning environment. It's essential that a clear, collectively developed and accepted vision is further broken down into actions and measures of key outcomes, with processes to track if the changes are resulting in improvements. It was not enough just to have a vision. We really needed to be able to take that vision and break it down. Leadership that builds a culture that coalesces the community around supporting the vision, determining the barriers to reaching the vision, and testing solutions to determine what works for whom and under what circumstances. They work on changing the school structures, the policies, and the roles, as well as changing classroom practices in alignment with this strategic plan for supporting the vision. They also are very data-informed schools, and they use data, they use data to be able to influence classroom practices as well as school practices. The sixth area that we looked at was there's an increased emphasis on instruction, collaboration, and communication over management, and it requires a greater depth and breadth of knowledges and practices related to these. Leaders are shifting emphasis from a management focus to concentrate their actions, their own personal learning, and their relationships with teachers on the core business of teaching and learning. This requires a huge in-depth knowledge of instructional strategies related to student-centered learning and the importance of home-school community connections and how to foster them, especially when the home and the community the cultures of the school and the home are different. Leaders have changed from primarily being managers to having more intentional, personalized interactions with the school. They understand the data that teachers are using, how the data is obtained, and apply that to instructional practices. Also, because of this increased emphasis on instruction, collaboration, and communication, they need to understand technology and how technology can be used to support instruction as well as supporting organizational operations. Some of the schools have, and districts have redefined roles so that the traditional role of a principal no longer exists. One of the principals that we were talking to, I just loved what she was saying. She said it was incredibly difficult and different when she moved from being a traditional school to being a student-centered school. That previously it was okay to lead a school and not be strong in all areas of leadership, but now she has to have her pulse on the instructional practices, do research to understand things, be present in the classroom, see the changes, both in instruction and in relationships, be present in the community, and also understand data and being able to do data analytics and support staff and students as they went through this data trip version themselves. She said it could be overwhelming, which is why it was so important to have a collaborative, cohesive leadership team. The seventh area that we were looking at is leaders' model practices, important organizational values aligned to the vision. The leaders act as mentors and coaches and support learners in the work. They support student agency and they support teacher agency. They have to model the variety of the aspects of student-centered learning and realize that mistakes will be made and mistakes provide opportunities for learning. And then the eighth area, which certainly is not the least important in this, was that leadership recognizes and acts upon the increased importance of attention to equity. That leadership focuses on the individual well-being and learning of each and every student with a commitment to ensuring equity and excellence. And that equity is really understood as an overarching goal of this transformation process. They create inclusive learning environments where all members can experience success, and the traditional barriers to equity are challenged and met with head-on innovative plans. They create learning communities that value diversity and promote equity and justice. Since leadership is more heavily involved in defining purpose and establishing vision than maintaining the status quo, they have to pay greater attention not only to the culture of their schools, but to do different ways of knowing and expressing knowing, and to the values of the parents, families, and communities. So again, as we were looking at this, we were just seeing that there's some key areas that leaders in student-centered schools, either there's more emphasis on these or they're new aspects of the role that they're needing to take on. So what we'd love to do is hear what you see as different or essential for leadership of student-centered learning, or of the things that we found, what do you think is key and what do you maybe disagree with? So feel free to share your thoughts in the chat, and also if you hit the talk button, first please raise your hand, and then, because hopefully we'll get a lot of people participating, and then once you're recognized, hit the talk button and you can go ahead and go live. question came up about how has leadership at different levels come into play. What we found was leadership at elementary, middle, and high school was slightly different. With high school, because generally high schools tended to be a little bit larger, that the high schools had more of a distributive and collaborative leadership, where instead of it, if it was a comprehensive high school, instead of it being that the principal of the school was interacting directly with everybody within the leadership team, they might be directly interacting with people who were the heads of different committees, and that those people, the heads of committees, were interacting with other people who were taking leadership roles within that community. I'm trying to read the, Barbara, if you jump in here too, because I'm trying to also read the chat board. Simon, your comment on a key point is about the transition of control. I was talking with people in a district that have been at this for about 5 years now, and what they said was it took about 3 years for the leadership teams within the school to be able to feel comfortable enough to be able to start taking more control. And part of the process that they had to use was to say, and they worked this out collaboratively, which was, what are the areas in which you can have your expanded leadership team make decisions, and they don't have to check with the principal of the school or the academic leader of the institution, that they can go ahead and make those decisions at their level, and as long as it's in alignment with the vision, no problems. And then here were some areas that were held close, where if they really wanted to change something, that it needed to come back to a broader leadership team.
One other thing that I'll add, or a couple of other things, I think we heard a lot of creative ideas, particularly from elementary level schools, where there may have been, where some principals may have felt, or the leadership teams may have felt, there's a little bit more flexibility to shake things up, and a little bit more flexibility in the schedule and in repurposing the use of space. And there were different schools that just invited the staff to come in, maybe setting up a whiteboard in either the faculty room or even broadly in the hallway to invite the whole school community to make suggestions, and then have a leadership team that was a cross-section, not just the principal or not just the administrative team, but pull together cross-section teams that would evaluate the proposed changes and then try to work on a plan to implement them. So there were a lot of efforts, varied efforts on that level, where the broader community was invited in to make suggestions, and a broader leadership team was given responsibility and able to assume responsibility for making the proposals about what to implement. I saw a question come by about trust, and I heard more than one school leader say, everybody talked about the importance of building a culture of trust, and that is challenging, and that it is so easy to break the trust. But one principal said to me that the encouragement was there to try things and fail. And he said the only feedback, and teachers started to see this, the only feedback for failing was, thank you for trying. And the more this principal practiced that, the more teachers felt like they really were trusted, and that they were going to get acknowledged for trying something even if it failed. So those are a couple of few examples that we saw. Anne asked early on, one last thing I'll just call attention to. Anne asked early on, how does the change in leadership affect the teacher's role? And a lot of what Liz is talking about, and I'm also seeing in the chat box, there's many impacts. One is teachers are being asked to take on leadership roles.
And a couple things that I just as I was scanning in through the chat box. In every single one of these institutions, there is a huge emphasis on growth mindset, and that everybody is learning. Mistakes are accepted. They're something that everybody makes, and what you do is you learn from those mistakes. And in some of the institutions, the way that they've built this into some of their strategic plans is, here is where we want to be. Is this leading us towards that? Yes or no? And if it's not, well, what else do we try? Rather than dealing with it as failures or successes, but how is it that we're continuing to learn and grow with this? They also used absolutely the improvement science strategies, which build on this notion of growth mindset and being able to go through continuous improvement. There's a great resource at the Carnegie site on that. I'm sure we missed questions here. Domains of leadership that are distributed. Pittsfield, New Hampshire did an absolutely amazingly in-depth study of taking a look at roles and what the different roles were in school, all the way from superintendent, going down to school principals, directors, students, parents. And then part of that, what they did was they talked about the areas of influence and which were direct and which were not direct. And then based upon some of that, they started looking at, well, within a school, where is it that groups can make decisions without having to go back up sort of the traditional chain of command. Their information is referenced in the resources for that blog. And I'd have to honestly go back and look and see. There were two other schools where they really had done a step-by-step kind of analysis of which kinds of things have to go back to the principals, which are ones that can be made at a lower level. Generally, things like instructional materials, certainly made at the teacher and classroom level. All of these emphasize teams of teachers rather than individual teachers, so that there was a consistency in the approach to what was going on. I'm watching time. With the principles decreased emphasis on management, how is management accomplished? Redistributing roles is one of the ways that management is accomplished. Every single one of these principles said that they are working very hard and very long. And as Barbara just said, technology. So certainly lots of questions were raised as we did this research. And Barbara, I'm going to move this to you because we've got time.
Right. And you guys do have such good questions. So that was how Liz and I felt as we did this research. We both were learning as well as identifying lots of new questions. So lots of questions that built on the original research that we felt were really important to pursue, and some of them are turning around our highlights. So those highlights led us to wanting to know more about those, and you'll see in the 5 questions, we had many. We have highlighted 5 questions that we thought were pretty important for further investigation. First one, and this kept coming up all of the time, how do the leadership challenges shift with each phase of the work? So we kept hearing from the people we talked to and seeing in the literature that we had to understand that leadership competencies and the most important leadership muscles or leadership skills would change depending on the phase of the implementation they were in. So we were hearing we're not going to find a static set of leadership competencies or leadership skills that would stand for all time. But what leaders wanted to know is, what do we need to know and what do we need to use and what do we have to build up in ourselves and in our team as we're getting started? And what are we going to need to know and how is that going to change when we're in the middle? And how is that going to change when we're really worried about sustainability? So understanding more about the how the skills shift and what's most important and what might recede a little is something to really understand more. Second big question that we know we have to learn more about, we both saw a wonderful emphasis and vision from the leaders that we talked to that that one of the a key driving force in their work was to achieve increased equity, to close achievement gaps, to build more inclusive school communities. So that was something that was that we heard across the board. We still don't know enough about how to do that. So how do leaders do this? What are the skills that they need? What are the strategies that they need as they pursue that goal and build equity as a driving force deep into their programs? So that's a second key question. Third, and we've been talking about it in our discussion, and that also, you can see that that's something that really needs a lot more understanding. If we're changing the leadership role, if it is becoming more distributed, more collaborative, if the leadership functions are being distributed across the school community, how do we do that? I know in response to one of the questions earlier, what skills are being distributed, one core example that we heard many times was the school leader was turning over some of their traditional professional development function to teacher teams, and even turning over leading the staff meetings to teachers and turning them into ed camps or professional learning opportunities, and they were using technology to send out their messages. There were little nuggets of strategies that leaders were using, but we need to know a lot more about what are models to really shake up and distribute leadership across the school organization. Fourth question, which came up a lot, was looking beyond the environment that they're leading and understanding the impact of broader leadership and policy supports or changes that may affect their ability to keep the initiative going. So leaders wanted to know more about how they build continuous support and continuous buy-in, particularly as the leadership and the policy environment changes. What should they be doing? Who should be doing it? Who should be working with them? What are the communication skills and strategies that would help? So there's a lot more to learn about how to prioritize this particular effort, which is time-consuming. So that's another big area that emerged. And one more area, we've only touched on formal research a little bit in today's webinar. And we found when we were doing the literature review that there was a fair amount of literature that connected the role of leaders and its impact on teachers. What we saw less of was the next level down. What are leadership activities that we can trace down to directly impacting students and student learning. So we know that, and this is a broader need beyond just student-centered learning environments, but we want to know more about what is it that leaders do that not only affect the level that leaders are most directly interacting with, which is usually the staff, but what is it that leaders do that are going to directly impact improved student learning? So that is our other big question that we're highlighting. Not that, if you can't tell, Liz and I were constantly generating new questions and hearing new requests for what leaders needed to know within the great support for pursuing the questions that we were addressing. So we only have a few minutes left, but we're curious, Liz and I are curious, what questions you have and what do you think are most important? And before I open it up, I just want to emphasize this conversation will continue. We'll be talking about these things at the iNACOL Symposium. The session is on Tuesday afternoon. A lot of what we've talked about is also in the blog post, which you'll see the link. It's in the chat box. It's also on the last slide. So there are ways to continue the conversation. But in the time we have here, and your comments have been fantastic, what do you think of the questions, and what questions do you have about leadership? What do you think of our questions? See, as I scroll through, there are some great resources and suggestions being shared. Are there other core questions that have been, what brought you here? What are you interested? What do you think is important for leadership to improve leadership in student-centered environments? So I see one comment there that is very true. It's great to think about teachers taking on more leadership, and we need to know more about that. And the comment was, well, is that just more, in a sense, is that just more for teachers to do? So we have to understand, it's really a question to keep investigating and to look for models and to really understand if we're inviting teachers to take on more leadership, what else changes in their role so that they actually can, and it's not an even further overload. And related to that, and what we heard in some settings, is the role of technology helping free up some time for teachers to take on these roles? And I see a great question again from Anne, sustaining the changes over time. Yes, lots more to know about that. Anything else, and anything you see that I've missed, Liz, in the comments there?
Sorry, I was just going back and reading through them. The issue that Paula raised, and you mentioned it, Barbara, about time. Time is a huge issue, not only for the teachers, but if you're trying to get community involvement with parents and other organizations, and really having to re-look at that whole issue of time and how time is used and ways that people can participate. Simone, you suggested looking into the open organization approaches. Do you mind talking a little bit about that? I don't know if you have a mic or if you could put something in the chat room. how to chat or how to use the mic. Oh, go up to the talk button and just click it at the very top of this panel.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
So the open organization, so if you're not familiar with Red Hat, they're one of the leading creators and use of open source Linux-based systems, which basically run a lot of universities. They're on a lot of servers that run most of the internet. So they have taken the concepts of open source software creation, which is very open, community-driven, and the CEO is who created this book, as he transitioned that perspective on creating software into running the company as a whole. So it's more than just the open door policy. It's kind of this way of distributing the leadership, distributing decision-making. He becomes a partner among all the members of the team in the company. And so I'm thinking, as I look through that context and thinking about school leadership, again, trying to fit that distributive model, how to encourage that type of work. So I know that often things are stood up in business and software and like, oh, well, shoehorn it into education and everything will be great. So I recognize that risk, but I think it might be an opportunity to see something that's been in action for a couple of years now at Red Hat, pretty large U.S. corporation, company that does these open source work pieces, and see if there's lessons that can be learned there.
That's great. Thank you, and thanks for putting the reference in there so people will be able to find it. One thing I want to call attention to, we've talked a little bit about sustainability. There's a lot more to know about sustainability. Something that we heard over and over again from the leaders was the importance of communication. And I've mentioned that a little, but putting a big priority on the words that many leaders used was telling your story. And if you don't tell your story, somebody else will. This came up over and over and over again. So being preemptive about sharing successes, and somebody in the chat room also asked about student leadership role, critical. Let the students get involved in telling the story. The students in using both in person and at board meetings and in other settings, as well as through social media, blogs, messages back to the parents. So communication is accelerated in importance in these settings. And I know we're almost out of time. We've really loved your questions and your comments, and it's renewing our recognition that this is a really important issue. There's a lot more we have to know, and there's a ton of interest in working together to figure out what we have to know, because we do all understand, and back to the very beginning of the webinar, leadership has a critical role in sustaining and developing and leading these initiatives that we're all committed to, and there's so much more that we have to understand about that role. We do hope that you'll keep the conversation going and you'll join us. Go ahead, Liz.
Sorry, I got bumped out of the room, so I was typing an answer back to someone just real quick on some of the resources for professional development. Some of the places that have taken this new way of looking at student-centered learning and developed some resources: Illinois, California, Ontario, and New Zealand. All of those are linked in this, the bibliography that we have for this blog. I love the questions in the chat board, really getting us back to thinking and rethinking here. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you all for coming and participating and driving our collective thinking. Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz and Barbara, for a wonderful webinar. This is such interesting and fascinating work. I hope everyone takes an opportunity to check out your blog to dig a little deeper on this. And if you are attending the iNACOL Symposium, Liz and Barbara will be exploring this in more detail on Tuesday, October 24th. So find them at 2:15 at the iNACOL Symposium in Orlando and continue the conversation there. So again, thanks so much to our presenters today, and we will send you an email with a link to this archived presentation within a couple days so you can refer back to any of the discussions today. Thanks a lot. Have a wonderful Wednesday.